The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, good morning, everyone. We're trying to start right at 11. We might still have some people coming in online and into the room, but I would like to welcome you all to Winrock and our innovation series here at Winrock. Today we wanted to look at how we can look at what is this forest-water interaction. How do they interact, and how should we consider those interactions when we're looking at decision-making and meeting development challenges? Oh, I forgot I have this. Okay, sorry. Oh, I forgot to say, sorry. I'm also, my name is Sarah Walker. I'm the director of the Ecosystem Services team here at Winrock. We developed this Innovations at Winrock Seminar series really to try to highlight some topics of international importance, some emerging science that is being developed, and look to see how we need to consider it when we're looking at development challenges. And we hope this forum can be a place for learning from each other and for discussion. We developed this seminar series in honor of the late Dr. Sandra Brown, who is one of our senior scientists here at Winrock. She was a real pioneer in demonstrating the role of forests in the carbon cycle and in climate change. She specialized in developing robust but accessible methods for assessing carbon stocks and estimating greenhouse gas emissions and removals from the land use sector. And of course, she was really well known for being a strong advocate for women in science. And I am very honored to say that to have had her be my mentor for over 20 years. We all miss her very deeply. Today, we will try very hard to keep a 1 hour, this webinar to 1 hour. We will start with an overview, introductions, then we'll move to our panelist discussions, panelist presentations, along with some discussion and questions from the audience. As we all know, forests are being lost, and they're being lost at an alarming rate, and they're being lost now at large scales, right? Continental level scales. At the same time, we're also seeing an increase in the frequency and the severity of extreme events, hydrological events especially. Floods, droughts are happening more severely around the globe. Historically, a lot of the research that was done on forests and on water was really kind of done separately, siloed from each other. We know that there's interactions, but a lot of times the research that is being done doesn't really integrate these as fully as maybe they should. And so we wanted to think of, we do know that forest and water interact, but we wanted to look more deeply at what this interaction really means and how we should consider it when we're thinking about how we're meeting development challenges. We know that water and forests interact in terms of surface water runoff and mitigation, nutrient runoff, erosion mitigation, and aquifer recharge. We wanted to look and see when we think about where we're placing forests and where we're conserving forests, and we're thinking about the water cycle, how do we need to consider those together? How do they need to be interacted together? We therefore brought together 3 experts in this field. Today we have with us Dr. Ellison, who is from the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. He's an expert on this forest-water dynamic. We also have Dr. Srinivasan from Texas A&M. He's one of the main developers of the SWOT model, which quantifies the impact of land use management practices on watersheds and on soil and water. We also have Mike Netzer with us from Winrock, who is an expert in using spatial data and modeling to analyze the impact of these changes on the landscape, and really how we can take that science and apply it in the development that we are working on all over the world to meet the challenges we're facing. Oh, sorry. Now we will now go to our first panelist, Dr. Ellison. David, can you hear us?
I'm unmuted, and now I'm trying to press my screen, and I can't seem to get my mouse to function. Perfect timing. It was working just fine before. Okay, I got it. All right. So what I would like to talk to you about is the potential for using improved knowledge about forest and water interactions in the context of a new potential forest and water agenda. And of course, I'm not an island. I work with a lot of people. I will point to 2 publications at the end of this that involve lots of other authors. But I'd like to start with this slide, which provides a picture of the global hydrologic cycle. And if you look at the global hydrologic cycle, one of the first things you notice is that the contribution of the oceanic evaporation to atmospheric moisture over land surfaces is actually relatively small. It's only 40,000 cubic kilometers. And the total amount of precipitation over land is considerably larger. So one of the first things you have to ask yourself is, where does the rest of that moisture come from? And of course, a lot of it comes from water that has first fallen as rainfall on land and then is re-evaporated back into the atmosphere, or is evapotranspired from forests and other types of vegetation into the atmosphere. And this accounts for a very large share. So precipitation recycling right away seems to matter and be important in this context. Now, the first question one should ask is, what happens if we take away the vegetation surface? So what kind of impact might that have on rainfall? And then, of course, what kind of impact might that have on the potential for, say, agricultural production or for the warming of terrestrial surfaces? And you can also go in the opposite direction. Historically, we've removed about 50% of forests from land surfaces. So what would happen if we put them all back and we had, of course, more evapotranspiration over land surfaces? Would that add to contribute to higher rates of precipitation? And if we had higher rates of precipitation, could we then produce more agricultural products? The agroforestry models talked about these days actually envision including trees and improving the productivity of agriculture. But of course, there's also significant competition between agriculture and forest, and so maybe we would have to produce less agriculture. But this gives you a basic idea of the precipitation recycling dynamic. Now, what I have argued for a long time is that we need to move away from the catchment basin focus, so focus on the water cycle only at the catchment scale. Most of the time when we analyze the water basin and the water balance, this is what we look at, the catchment. We don't look beyond the catchment. So we look at how much precipitation comes in, how much water gets removed in terms of by evapotranspiration from forests and other uses of the land surfaces, and then how much less water is left over in terms of runoff that can be consumed for other uses. Now, the interesting thing is we don't, even in this context, even though there are lots of studies of the catchment, we don't know what happens to that ET on the basis of these studies. Now, our knowledge of what happens with ET has improved over time. We know that at least some of it is recycled back within the local catchment to precipitation, but it's a relatively small amount, and the lion's share still gets flushed out of the basin and goes out as atmospheric moisture to other locations. But if you think that forests are valuable for water, a lot of people think if you just add forests to the catchment, what will happen? And of course, here you may get a little bit more evapotranspiration recycled back as precipitation within the catchment, but still the lion's share is going to go out. So if you look only at the catchment, forests are negative for water. They take water out of the basin, they flush it into the atmosphere, and it moves on. However, the other question we should be asking ourselves is what explains precipitation in the first place? Once again, catchment basin studies do not do this. And of course, when you ask yourself what explains precipitation in the first place, you suddenly begin to realize that the world is a much more complicated place. A fair amount of oceanic evaporation contributes to precipitation, but also evapotranspiration over upwind land surfaces matters a lot. And if evapotranspiration over upwind land surfaces matters a lot, land use practices in the upwind continent also have an influence on the total amount of evapotranspiration that is produced, and that can then potentially become precipitation within a basin. And of course, the same relationship is true in the basin. And of course, what happens in the basin and in the upwind areas also influences downwind precipitation. So all of these basins are essentially, or all these catchments are essentially interconnected. If you ask a forest hydrologist or talk to a forest hydrologist about this for a while, basically we can all agree on this basic image of the land atmosphere, forest and water interaction. Where we have problems is in being able to identify the precise recycling ratios, both at the local scale, so how much ET gets recycled back into precipitation, and also the continental upwind recycling ratios. Essentially, the technology that we have allows us to do this to some degree, but it's not as good as it could be and could use some improvement. Now, once you understand these basic relationships, it makes it much easier to understand these two slides, which show the relative dependence of different areas of the world on evapotranspiration from land surfaces for the rainfall that occurs. So in these red areas, they are as much as 80, 70, 80, 90% dependent on evapotranspiration from land surfaces and receive very little water from oceanic evaporation. And of course, the upwind areas, for the upwind areas, it's more or less the opposite. They receive most of their water from oceanic evaporation. But of course, the evapotranspiration that the upwind areas produce goes on to other locations and is important from other locations. So you can't escape from this connectivity of land-based systems. And all of these areas are important across land surfaces. Now, I'd like to try and emphasize this idea of spatial organization with two examples. And the first one on the left, we have the situation where we decide to afforest the upwind continent and deforest the catchment on the right. And we produce, as a result, more evapotranspiration over the upwind continent. That has a positive impact on precipitation in the catchment and on essentially on water runoff in the catchment in particular, because we've also deforested the catchment. But of course, the other consequence is that we have less evapotranspiration going out of the catchment, and that may be important to downwind users. So you have to be able to think about these relationships in a larger landscape framework. If you take the example on the right, we do the reverse. We take away the forest cover in the upwind continental area with producing less evapotranspiration over those land surfaces, and we afforest the catchment. And in this case, we have less precipitation coming in, and of course, more ET evapotranspiration going out of the catchment because we've increased the forest cover, and the impact on water availability is quite significant in this context. So you can imagine the situation where people are thinking about engaging in reforestation because they think that forests are good for water, but if they're not thinking in the larger context, you could have potentially very negative outcomes. Now, on the basis of this, it's possible to build a series of potential win-win reforestation scenarios. One can, for example, focus on the reforestation of upwind coast to produce more evapotranspiration that doesn't affect the local water balance as much. There are a lot of catchments where the water supply is relatively abundant and where moderate trade-offs are acceptable. It's important to recognize that not all locations are water stressed. Flood-prone areas is another good example. And of course, it's important to recognize that with climate change, not all places in the world are experiencing increasing temperatures and declining rainfall. For example, in the boreal, northern boreal regions, they're actually experiencing increasing rainfall, and this ultimately makes trees and forests more attractive. And of course, you could then move more of that moisture onto other locations to benefit other parts of the world. Now, there are two relationships which I didn't manage to talk about, forest-water interaction relationships I didn't manage to talk about. I'll just quickly say that forests are important for groundwater recharge, and they are also important at high altitudes for extracting water from trees. And of course, reforestation can be important for both of those. And finally, it's extremely important to take into consideration the local context, because every situation is always just a little bit different, every one that I look at. And so some of the ideas have to be modified based on local conditions. The way that mountains surround the area or not, what the wind patterns are, weather patterns, and so on. But the general basic relationships hold throughout. And if you want to know more, these are two publications that attempt to talk about these as well as many other issues, in particular on the one on the left. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Srini. Srini, I think you're on mute. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yep, I'm sorry. Just to follow up on what David's saying, actually, I just wanted to give what are the ways in which we can quantify that interaction that he's talked about actually between forest and water. There are lots of challenges how you want to go about kind of quantifying that actually. So there are various tools and technologies out there that one could use. Some of them could be purely remote sensitivity based, or some of them are model based, and sometimes it's a combination of the both actually. So I'm going to just talk about in the next few minutes on how where the technology is today. It's not, it's not surprising when you look at this map, where are the conflicts or the hotspots on related to water around the world actually. The major ones are right in the Middle East, like Tigris and Euphrates, as well as in Africa, like the Nile River Basin. Then in the Asia, that's where you have the Indus, Ganges, as well as Mekong River Basin actually. So the circle here shows the number of conflicts over the years actually that has happened in this region. So they are cross-country, but nowadays within the country we have a lot of issues also actually. So if you look at different states, sharing knowledge and information and data and so on and so forth. So one of the things that has to emerge from all this stuff would be, how do you make this information, knowledge, an open source environment, thereby everybody using the same information to make decisions and come to the table for negotiation and things of that nature. So the challenges that we talk about in terms of how you estimate where is the water, how does who are the consumer of the water, where the water goes, that is only less than 1% of the world that's getting really monitored actually. That means you don't really know what's happening. If you're waiting for observations to come through, it's going to be very limited. I'm talking about both spatial in scale as well as temporal scales. However, the decisions are continuing to get made actually, either it's political decision or social, ecological, environmental, whatever may be the reason actually, the decisions will continue to be made actually. So models are the only way for us to extend. When I talk about model, I'm talking about both remotely sensed satellite-based derived products or models such as SWOT, soil and water assessment tool. That's one of the largest application in ours. It has got more than 3,500 peer-reviewed publications. It's been used all over the world in conjunction with remotely sensed. So remotely sensed products can drive or be the input to the SWOT model. And later when Mike will talk about, he's going to mention some other stuff also in his application. The last two things is the key that I'm mostly working on in recent years is we are not talking the same language actually. Our scientists are talking past each other within the scientists. I'm talking about policymakers or economists or environmentalists and social scientists and so on and so forth actually. So we need to start thinking about coming to a common terminologies and common understanding of how we want to share our knowledge and information and so on. And finally, that knowledge and information have to be made public domain actually. A lot of this information is locked in within few groups or individuals or organizations that is not getting across to the transboundary issues that we are facing today actually. Most of our transboundary issues, especially for Nile Basin, none of the other country knows what the kind of water production in other countries, for example. So if you look at it, based on one of the recent papers, at least about $100 million were spent on Nile Basin alone in estimating water availability over the last 25 years. But if you look at it, even today, we are still developing new models for the same basin, actually. We should have all this information already in the public domain and the models and the data. Thereby, everybody should be sharing the same knowledge and information in making decisions and coming together on the table for further discussion. So the satellite products are emerging. It's continuing to evolve, and there are a lot of work has been done in the last 20, 30 years, actually, especially all the way from precipitation, how much rainfall. There is a new product called GPM with a very high resolution of every 3 years, and TRM is another rainfall product. And then, of course, the soil moisture, again, different resolution, spatial and temporal resolution. And of course, the vegetation like NDVI or EVI and so many other different products, actually. So all these are all integral part because we can monitor only so much on the ground. We heavily rely on remotely sensed products to do most of our work, actually. And of course, it comes with some baggage in terms of quality and accuracy, as well as the scale in which you can apply some of these, because they are all, as you can see, the spatial resolutions are completely different, all the way from a few kilometers to hundreds of kilometers, actually. So one has to be careful on what application, the size of the watershed, or the size of the area that you're trying to use from country to continental scale. If you want to apply to an individual farmer's level, probably we are not there yet in terms of using satellite-based products. In a simple mind, if you look at where the water is, change in water is equal to the evaporation and transpiration minus whatever the precipitation and any kind of water that's getting diverted from the river for other uses, actually. So you can estimate the evapotranspiration through satellites. You can estimate the precipitation from the satellites. So thereby you can kind of estimate how much is the soil moisture or soil water available, as well as the river flows and things like that. But it gives you only the historical perspective, or only for the time period that you have the data for, and things of that nature. However, in combining the remote sense data with models such as SWOT, you will be able to not only look at the past, but also look into the future. Either that's because of you want to run a scenario, like, for example, afforestation or deforestation, or you want to look at climate change impact, or you want to look at land use change impact, and so on and so forth, actually, or land policy, or look at putting a dam or reservoirs or anything of that matter. You'll be able to do that by combining the remotely sensed products with that of simulation models. So in this regard, I talked about the spatial and temporal scale in a large context, actually, but we also have the same spatial and temporal scale at the micro scale, meaning at the individual farm or individual field or individual parcel level, actually. Not all that has the same time frame. Your precipitation could be only in few hours, whereas your evapotranspiration could be up to a day, and your soil moisture could take anywhere between few days to a week, and your lateral and groundwater could be weeks to months, and the deep aquifer recharge could be years, actually. So they are all come at different time scales here, actually. So one has to take into account. So what happened? This is a schematic diagram of how the SWOT model works, and the only input here is what your land use and what your precipitation and temperature data set, and the rest are all calculated automatically to give you not only the big picture of where the water is coming from, or what are the different user of the waters within the landscape, but also it gives you the different components. Thereby, if you do want to manage your water, what do you have to the different components? You can make adjustments to make the difference. So, for example, if you remove the forest and put a agricultural land, how that's going to change? For example, if we do take the forest and convert it into agriculture or urban or grassland or whatever it may be, what is that going to do, actually? So I'm talking about reforestation. So let's say I'm going to increase the forest rather than decreasing. Whatever I'm going to say is going to have a negative effect if you decrease the forest. So that's going to decrease your runoff. If you increase your forest, that means more interceptions, more evapotranspirations, that means less runoff, actually. So less runoff, but there's going to be more infiltration. That means you're going to have increase in lateral flow, and you're going to have an increase in groundwater contribution back to the river, actually. So that means your base flow or the low flows or ecological flow or environmental flows are going to tremendously help by increasing the forest. But that's not where it stops, actually. As David was mentioning, actually, it also has a great influence on decreasing sediment, decreasing nutrients, pesticides, organic carbon, anything that you can think of, actually, has got to have a great impact due to the change in forest cover, actually. So if you don't do that, you're not going to, I mean, if you start removing forest, all these things will go on the opposite direction, actually. So that's going to have a bigger impact. Like more erosion means more sediment, more runoff, and more of nutrients, and so on and so forth, actually. So I want to just talk about in two simple examples where we have done work with various international agencies. So this is an area, Tigris and Euphrates River, actually. Already there are tons of dams, actually. Now there is even more dams are planned, and not each country is talking to other. For example, Turkey. So they are building a new dam. Okay, originally it's supposed to be financed by Germans. They backed out with the environmental pressures. Now the Turkey going themselves building this dam. If you all know where is this is the Iraq border. Just on the other side of the Iraq, we have a dam that is the same size as this dam here, actually. It's the dam called Mosul Dam. I know you all heard this in the news. So there is no planning, there is no coordination, there is no cooperation across the countries here, actually. This is doomed to have a disaster waiting to happen, actually, in any time soon, if there is not a standard information that's shared across the various countries and continents to work together on solving the problem rather than trying to build a dam just across the border with the same capacity. And there is also talking about another dam here, actually. All these things are going to have a huge ecological and environmental as well as social conflicts that's waiting to happen here, actually. And on the other hand, the same knowledge and information is well preserved, well shared across the different countries like Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and Thailand. They do have their personal differences, but when it comes to the water sharing and water, because water is life in this region, and they do share the water data. They do have a common model. They have formed a commission that they all share the knowledge. It's in the USAID started this work, and there is a lot of European agencies are contributing to this. And this is the China part. They are the only one not on the table right now. Everybody else, the one on the green, they are all on the table and working with the same knowledge, same information, same resources to look at the impact of the major dams that's been built, some of the smaller dams, the irrigation development that's going on simultaneously, and the forest cover reduction that's going on. This you all seen recently, a major dam that got broke in Laos. That's because of some of the losses and excess runoff that contributed that issue there, actually. Freshwater fisheries issues as well as the brackish water fisheries. So all this thing could be resolved, could be studied if you have knowledge and information that's shared across multiple country or transponder issues. So in short, I just want to reiterate, sharing the knowledge and talking the same language is extremely critical. It's not only the advance of science, but we also have to have the way to share and communicate to the others. Let me stop right there.
Great, thank you so much, Srini. We're going to now move to Mike Netzer.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Just 1 second. I'm just getting my computer set up. Okay, you guys can see my screen? Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. It's great to be here. It's a real honor to be able to speak with both David and Allison here in this workshop. My name is Michael Netzer. I'm a GIS and remote sensing expert here at Winrock International. So it's clear from all these presentations that forests, of course, play a critical and important role maintaining and regulating the ecosystem services that we all rely on, right? Both locally at the watershed, flood control, water availability, water quality, sediment and nutrients, all the way to, as David outlined, at the continental and global scale, really influencing dramatically rainfall and climate. And as well globally, influencing greenhouse gas emissions, forests. The availability and quality of water, of course, is fundamental to people and therefore to development, from international development organizations like Winrock to countries, developing natural resource management plans. Monitoring of these ecosystem services, these hydrological ecosystem services, is very complex and dynamic. And this is especially true in developing countries where data is scarce. This complexity contributes to what Srini was talking about, that only 1% of water is really monitored, and that this is leading really to ill-informed decisions. And this is often happening in countries where it may be most needed in the developing world. From the Winrock development perspective, working with countries and agencies on land use issues, the big question for us has been, is the technology and information at a point where it can monitor key aspects of hydrology with enough accuracy to inform on-the-ground decisions, from the farm scale all the way up to the watershed and national scale? Winrock's Ecosystem Services Group, who I work for, has been working in the science of carbon accounting, climate change, climate adaptation, of forests and agriculture for over 20 years. This work contributes to the larger body of science that has really resulted largely in some agreed upon methods and for greenhouse gas accounting, IPCC, UNFCCC, etc. Through ECO's work, it has become increasingly apparent that by just focusing on carbon as the main ecosystem services of forests, we may be missing important opportunities to help inform on key aspects of sustainable land use development, primarily as it relates to water. From this carbon-centric perspective, water is treated as a co-benefit. It is not that water is thought less important, absolutely not. It is key. It's just that it's oftentimes assumed that by preserving the forest for the carbon, you're also preserving it for the water. And because there's large international agreements on carbon, it's just easy to fall into that perspective. However, by not focusing more on water more explicitly, by not working towards agreed on metrics on monitoring and reporting, as has been done largely for carbon, are we missing an important opportunity to better inform overall sustainable development and at the landscape scale and for natural resource management planning? Planting trees will always store carbon, but this is not the case for water. As the previous presenters have been showing, the existence of forests in an upper watershed may be very different, have a very different impact than the protection of forests in a lower watershed. The planting of forests on different slopes and practicing different land use will have different impacts on the processes like sediment and nutrient loss. Not only that, but as Ellison describes so well, at a large scale, we're often missing this incredible contribution that forests provide to rainfall and overall climate. To address this, Winrock has been piloting ways to integrate water into its carbon accounting and natural resource planning. So Winrock has been developing a set of methods that integrate water into kind of our carbon accounting system and our land use planning process. The most developed example of this right now is the Watershed Ecosystem Service Tool, the WEST tool as we call it, which was developed for Cambodia under a USAID project funded there. The WEST tool integrates well-established satellite and remote sensing products. Srini overviewed those to track land use changes. It integrates it with hydrological modeling, and we use the SWAT model for that, and local data, local land management data, and we combined it into a web map easy to use web map format where users can view and analyze data related to carbon, water, and climate change. With this tool, users can see not only land use and carbon stocks, but also underlying hydrological properties like nutrient loss to the river and groundwater infiltration. So here's a brief example of how the WEST tool is the data from the WEST tool. Here you can see the two images, or the first one from 2000, kind of on the left, and then to 2015 on the right. And right there in the middle, I circle it because it's hard to kind of see, but there's 3 large land use concessions that were developed over that period of time. And on the charts on the right, which are a byproduct, a product of the WEST tool, you can see when that deforestation happened, the carbon emissions, the area lost, but also looking just down from that, you can see the effects that that might have had on groundwater recharge. And you can see that groundwater or aquifer recharge, that it goes down almost by half in that area from that development. Then just below that, you can see the impacts on nutrient loss. And you can see, again, a pretty dramatic rise in the nitrate runoff into the rivers. But the WEST tool doesn't just assess the past. The WEST tool also shows the potential impacts. It projects the potential impacts that would happen in the future if a place was deforested. Just up here, just north of those concessions that were developed on the Mekong River, that's the blue river right there on the right-hand side. This 12,000 hectare concession just west of the Mekong is still 68% forested. Its proximity to the Mekong, moderate slopes and soil make it prone to erosion. The results from the WEST tool suggest that if the remaining forest was developed, excuse me, nitrogen loads would of course increase, and you can see that in the charts on the right. Groundwater would decrease, and of course there would be a carbon emission. These results are just produced from the model, and they're not exact. However, they provide a magnitude and a direction of change that can help land use planners potentially. So the tool is not meant to be a deterrent from development, just a quantification of the impacts on ecosystem services that is so often missing from resource management decision plans. For the Tonle Sap watershed outlined here, as you can see, which is a vital resource for the people of Cambodia, it helps you to understand what if you planted forests here, what if you developed cropland there, planted a plantation over here. You can assess the impacts on the individual watersheds of the Tonle Sap and the entire Tonle Sap to try to piece together what would be a better development trajectory to conserve water, to avoid pollution, that supports all these vital resources like agriculture and fishery. So the WEST tool is just one example, but we're really here to pose more of a question. For example, that's why we were really excited to have David on this call, because we don't assess kind of the continental scales that this land use change might be happening. So how can we more explicitly integrate water into kind of the carbon accounting, this forest-centric decision-making process? Clearly, there needs to be variables agreed on and consistently measured. There needs to be methods for monitoring, reporting, and verifying. We did this for carbon. Can we do it for water? Finally, these need to be integrated, these variables and these methods need to be integrated into the existing programs out there. We believe that data and information is there to monitor hydrologies across large landscapes. If this is true, the next question is, how can we better integrate it into existing programs in a more explicit way? With large national and global reforestation programs like the Bond Challenge and the New York Declaration, this may be a really important time to be able to make these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to now move on to some panel discussion. First, we'll talk about the main conclusions we can see from different presenters, I do want to remind people that if they have questions, the people that are online, if they have questions, they can enter them into the questions panel, and also that this webinar is being recorded and could be therefore listened as needed. So when we looking at these three presentations, I feel like we definitely could come to some main conclusions. One is that where forests exist really matters. This interaction, there's a real interaction between forests and the climate, the topography, the prevailing winds that really can have an impact on water availability across the landscape. But in addition, although water isn't very well monitored locally, we have developed a lot of science that allows us to understand these potential impacts, regardless of the existence of local data. We can use remote sensing combined with models to really examine what the impact of land management decisions will be across the landscape. And it will be essential for us to bring this understanding to policy makers. So now we're going to go to a couple different, a couple different questions to our panel. The first is, what are the main scientific or technical information gaps where additional research should be prioritized? Dave, do you maybe?
Yeah, so I think one of the big problems is that we don't really know very well how much, what kinds of vegetation types produce how much evapotranspiration. The technologies available for measuring these things come to disagreements. And so it's very helpful, or would be very helpful, to know precisely that a eucalypt tree produces so much evapotranspiration in a particular context, and a pine will produce a different amount, and the growth of corn will produce another amount. But we don't, it's very difficult to get very, very precise numbers of the production of evapotranspiration. And the comparison of different technologies like that from eddy flux towers or from MODIS evapotranspiration remote sensing, they come up with relatively different numbers on these things. So we need better data, which means we need better technology in order to be able to measure these things more precisely. I think that's a very important one. And being able to measure exactly how much forest we need to produce a relationship in a specific place is also very problematic and difficult to measure adequately. And we can with certainty produce more evapotranspiration by planting more forest, but being able to target where that rain will fall is significantly more complicated. So I think those are the two issues that I would see most important.
Great. Trini or Mike, do you want to add anything? Yes, no.
I could just say one thing. You know, definitely one of the major limitations of our work there in Cambodia was just on the ground information. You know, well-established gauging stations, and even some information on what are the sediment loss rates, what are the nutrient loss rates, because all these models are often only as good as the validation data that you have. So that's certainly something that I find is missing, and it is very much a challenge to get, primarily in developing countries.
Great. So the idea that although we can use remote sensing and models to get a sense of things, that doesn't preclude the need for on-the-ground measurements in the field to validate and parameterize those models. Great. Trini, anything else, or we can move on? Okay, let's go to the next. The next question is about how this research that's being done, these findings that you've uncovered, how that should be communicated and discussed with policy makers, and how can they integrate this information into land use planning? Sri, do you want to start with that?
Sri, I think you're self-muted.
Okay, let's have
David.
David.
Can you speak now? Are you available?
Okay, I can speak because you guys muted me. I'm not able to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. And I mean, come to the data issues we talked about. Actually, the one thing I already mentioned, alluded, was on the remote sense data. They are in different scales, and they are in different both spatial and temporal scales. And the other biggest challenge would be the big data. The data is really, really voluminous, both in space and time and the frequency and so on. So you have to have large enough computing system, which is we are overcoming over the current technologies, but still it's a big data challenge. And then the data is accessible and available only to few. It's not available widely yet. So these are all some of the challenges in terms of the scientific data that can be potentially used to answer some of these questions here, actually.
Mike, do you want to build off of that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. If we're still talking about are we still talking about data and availability of data, Sarah?
Or, you know, Shree's point of the fact that although these remote sensing products and these models do exist, they're kind of really still housed, the knowledge about them and how they can be used is really still housed within a few select number of scientific entities, universities and researchers. And one of maybe the challenges is kind of how we can use technology, computing technology, to share that information with the world and democratize that information. And I think that's certainly one of the things that we at Winrock are trying to do. I think the West Tool is a good example of that attempt, where we're trying to take that very sophisticated technological work and bring it to the people and allow that to be allow the everyday person to be able to access that information. So my own, I guess, part of the answer would be that, that we really need to think about how we can continue making easy to access, how we can make this information more easy to access to the decision makers and also to the private sector and the civil society and common people. So yeah. Winrock can maybe, West may be helpful for that.
I would only add to that. I mean, you're absolutely right, and that's what Srini, you were talking about. How do we get it to the decision makers? And yes, that's what the goal of West Tool was. But for those listening, keep in mind all those satellite platforms, everything we built the West Tool with, that is available online largely for free. SWAT is free. These amazing satellites from NASA are free. It's just that it takes a technical person to pull them together. You can't expect decision makers in, say, Cambodia to find it. So keep in mind that the data is there and it's available. So that's important.
Great. Maybe we can move on to, should we move on to questions from audience?
If I might just add one last point, since I think it matters, and that is that it's important to be able to connect these models, so the catchment models, with the larger landscape. Both Michael and Srini suggested that that's important, and I think it matters a lot, because what is traditionally done is to look at the catchment, but we don't connect it to the larger landscape idea that I'm trying to present. And it clearly matters in terms of the availability of moisture for potential rainfall. So I think that's the next big step, is how to do that adequately.
Great. We have one question. Am I reading this or am I letting this person?
Yeah, no, you read this, but then we'll go to the.
Okay. We'll start first with a question from online. This is from Chris Farley. He's asking how much this work is likely to change a project's design. So how should, when you're designing a project, how should you consider this information? And if this information is just provided, does this affect whether or not forest conservation is maybe encouraged or discouraged based on the potential view of the adverse effects on water? So I guess the question is, how should we consider this information in project design?
Okay, I can say that definitely most of the project that I have seen is done on a retrospective, meaning the project is already carried on, then they are looking at the effect of the impact of deforestation and what do we need to do to recover after the deterioration of your watershed and things like that. Actually, I have not seen any projects so far that looked at the impact of forest ahead of the time before they build the dams or before they build any kind of projects or development activities within the watershed, actually. So I would completely support the idea of looking at the impact of forest removal or forest impact on water and water resources before that any project is implemented.
That would be a good step. Is do this. David, any other additions?
Yeah, I think countries need to spend a lot more time thinking about the upwind sources of atmospheric moisture for rainfall in the locations that they want to affect. Because with this catchment basin perspective, once again, most people focus explicitly on the catchment and they don't think about where is the best location, or they don't really understand where is the best location to plant more forest in order to influence more atmospheric moisture coming in and then potentially increasing rainfall in the locations they're concerned about. So I recently was invited to Brazil to talk with some people who are working on proposing reforestation strategies for the Brazilian government. And when we looked at the strategies, they very quickly realized that what I suggest is locations that they hadn't even considered for planting forests, because I'm thinking about where are the sources of moisture coming from to begin with. So I generally think that countries need to take a look at this themselves, because every situation is a little bit different. And so you have to analyze this at the local or regional scale and think in terms of projects for, in particular, reforestation projects. What impact does this have on the flow of atmospheric moisture? Is this going to help my precipitation in any way, or is it going to take away water from the basin? And where might I better plant forests in order to bring more atmospheric moisture into the basins that I'm concerned about? So countries, I think, need to focus on that in part themselves. They need to think about this larger connection to the landscape level. You can't just focus on the catchment.
Great. Maybe we can see if there's any questions here in the room. And we're welcome. I know we're kind of running out of time in a few minutes, so if you want to stay on, you're welcome to. But also feel free, to depart if that's necessary. Please introduce yourself as well first.
Thank you very much. My name is Mary Melnick. I'm the Environmental Security and Resilience Team Leader at USAID's Asia Bureau. Thank you so much for such a very informative presentation. I was just wondering if the models that the panelists have been working on, to what extent do they address temperature? And temperature is such a variable on many different levels. Not only on influencing evapotranspiration, but changing global temperatures, as well as the fact that we know that trees modulate temperature as well. So there are several layers there, if anyone could speak to that in the relationship between water and trees. Excellent.
So generally in the work that I've done, we think that the addition of forest cover has a positive impact on temperatures. In other words, more forest cover will lower temperatures, and this can be at the local scale all the way up to the global scale. And so more forest cover, as long as there's adequate water supply for it, is a good thing in terms of helping to cool surface temperatures on the planet.
I do agree with that actually. However, the temperature also has an impact on the groundwater actually, because the more forest you're going to have, changing the hydrology from more surface flow to groundwater flow, that means the water coming under the ground, you will have slightly cooler effects than whatever that's running off from the landscape actually. So the water temperature in the river also will change. That's going to impact some of the flora and fauna, fish productions and things of that nature actually. However, if you have a dam downstream for hydropower, that may all change. So that is a both positive and negative effect depending on how it was perceived or what's the intention of the analysis maybe.
Excellent. I hadn't thought about this. Changing the water temperature in the rivers. That's a very interesting point. Any other questions from the room? Okay, we will move on to a question on not the table. Sorry. From the webinar, we have Elaine Springay. I think that's right. Sorry. The language issue. She asks that the language issue is an important one, not only between scientists and policymakers, but between forests and the water sector. In your experience or perspective, how do we exit this echo chamber and move that to the wider audience? And examples of challenges and successes that you've had would be really useful.
Maybe I could speak to that a little bit. I think from my experience doing this in a number of different countries and kind of taking, I come from the technological side, so I really get focused on that. But working at Winrock in a development organization, it's become so clear to me that these things, language is one thing, right? Of course, it has to be in their language, but translating science into policy and making sure that it integrates into country policies, it really takes, it's almost like the technology bit that we're talking about is the easy bit. The hard bit is the development side and getting yourself in the office, into the decision maker's office, so that it grows from them, right? It comes from those agencies that need it, from those governments that want it. I think so often we build these amazing technological tools and then they never get used because it has to integrate into a policy context. If you're a land use manager in Cambodia, yeah, that's great. You can see this cool tool, but you got a job to do and you got to tick some boxes. And so I think that that's really important to stress here for everyone that's on the development side. It's the stakeholder engagement that really takes the time. The technology, I feel like we're all presenting is there. So that's my thought.
Yeah, I do agree with Michael, what he said actually, but along with the stakeholder, we have to bring in the education part actually. A lot of the things that what we are talking about may go over a lot of people's head actually. So we have to simplify this and make it available. When you're communicating between different science, like economists or policymakers or social scientists with environmentalists or hydrologists or remote sensing scientists, they don't communicate in the same term actually. So how do you convert the information into some dollars and cents? Everybody can understand dollars and cents. So if there is a way we can monetize a lot of this information, things get much easier to understand, our livelihood or some type of common indices or common platform that we all can share and exchange information from one model or from one system to another. It makes life a lot easier and simpler actually. But before even going there actually, sharing all this information in a public domain world like what you guys are doing now is more important there actually. So because there are lots of people are restricted or not having access and information is also equally bad, not only the communication part, but not having access to the information.
We can take what, maybe we'll take I'll kind of combine a couple of questions from online. Well, and then we'll take that as the final question. There were some questions about maybe David, you can speak a little bit more about the influence that forests can play in terms of changing wind patterns and how that interacts with the water cycle. You spoke very briefly about the idea of these water towers, but there was a question looking for a little bit more information on that.
So the water tower idea was simply that cloud forests or high altitude forests can extract a certain amount of water right out of the atmosphere as clouds pass through them. So they have to be at least at the height of clouds. When clouds pass through them, water condenses on leaf surfaces, on plant surfaces, on bark surfaces, and so you tend to get much more runoff or infiltration and groundwater recharge going into the catchment than if those cloud forests had been removed. Because if the trees aren't there, then clouds will just move on, and you'll lose that additional water supply. Then rainfall actually has to occur. But high altitude forest, cloud forests can extract moisture straight out of the air. But I'm not sure that's an answer to the question, because it sounded like there were two questions there. One about wind patterns and moisture, which may be a slightly different question. But we're also finding that heavy forest cover matters because it influences wind patterns. It slows down winds overall, and that leads to higher precipitation. So the Amazon is a very good example. There's heavier rainfall and slower wind patterns and heavier rainfall over the most heavily forested areas of the Amazon. And of course, if you lose that forest cover, then wind speeds are higher, you have less rainfall occurring.
Great. Any other questions for the audience, or else we'll wrap this up? Okay, great. Thank you all for being here today, both online and here in the room. And also definitely like to again thank our panelists, Dr. Ellison, Dr. Srinivasan, and Mike Netzer. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.